Hi everyone, so welcome to this first video lecture. We're going to talk about critical thinking and ethical concepts for business ethics, focusing on the document that's part one. So here are the topics that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to focus on some of the key concepts in that first document. So we're going to talk about what is an argument, the different parts of an argument, the difference between deductive and inductive arguments, and then we're going to talk about assessing arguments, so seeing whether they're good or bad arguments. And there are a number of different ways to do this, so we're going to talk about validity and soundness in deductive arguments and strength and cogency in inductive arguments. Here's a simple example to illustrate some of the basics about arguments. So the first thing here to talk about is what makes this an argument? So have a think about that. How would you answer that question? What makes this an argument rather than just an opinion? Okay, if you have an idea, let's talk about that a little bit. The reason that this is an argument rather than just an opinion is that the conclusion is that Beyonce is mortal. That's what you're trying to set out. That's the point you're trying to make, the point you're trying to get across in this argument, what you're trying to convince your interlocutor, the person you're talking to, of. So you're not just saying that Beyonce is mortal. You're actually giving a set of reasons that hang together in a certain way. So you have good reason for your conclusion that Beyonce is mortal. So those reasons are all humans are mortal, and Beyonce is one of those humans, so she's got to be mortal. Even though it seems a little funny to admit that Beyonce is mortal, but nonetheless, if she's human and all humans are mortal, then she's got to be mortal. Okay, so now you've got some solid reasons for thinking that Beyonce is mortal. And that's what makes a difference between an argument and an opinion. So what makes the difference is that in an argument, you're backing up your conclusion with reasons, and those reasons hang together in a structure that makes sense. So those reasons work together to lead you towards the conclusion that you're trying to get across. And this is a nice simple example of just that. So that's what makes this an argument rather than an opinion. And of course, in philosophy and in ethics as a branch of philosophy, the whole thing we're up to is making good arguments and giving good reasons for what we're saying. So arguments are going to be very, very important to us. Opinions, not so much. But what you think backed up by reasons, yeah, absolutely, we're interested in that. Okay, so next, can you identify the parts of an argument? So remember from the text, this is all about those things, premises and conclusion. So take a moment and can you identify the parts of this argument? Could you put the correct label on each of those statements? I'll just give you a second to see if you can do that. Okay, so all humans are mortal would be premise one. Right, that's step one or reason number one in the argument. Beyonce is human would be premise two, right? So step two or reason number two in the argument. And then the conclusion is, therefore Beyonce is mortal. So not always, but often you'll have a word like therefore or because of that, something like that to indicate that this is the conclusion. Okay, so that's the parts of this argument. The next thing that we're going to talk about is what type of argument it is. Now, arguments do different kinds of work. Moral arguments, generally speaking, are what we call deductive arguments, meaning that the conclusion that they aim for is conclusive, certain, 100%. So if you're right, if your argument works, then it will lead you to a 100% certain conclusion. Right, that's what you're aiming for. So the difference between deductive and inductive is a difference in what each argument is trying to do. So a deductive argument, which again most moral arguments are deductive, is trying to get you to agree that yes, 100% the conclusion is definitely the case. Inductive arguments, which often you find in everyday life and in lots of different arenas of life, but aren't as common in moral theorizing or moral reasoning. Inductive arguments are all they're trying to do is show you that something is probably or likely the case. Now, that doesn't mean they're not as good as deductive arguments. There are lots of things in life where you would want to just show that something is probable or likely. So is it going to rain today? Well, you're not going to be able to be 100% certain, maybe unless you're a meteorologist, but really you're dealing with probabilities. Right. Or am I going to like the strawberry ice cream at this new ice cream shop, given that I've always liked strawberry ice cream every other ice cream shop I've gone to? Maybe not 100%, but you'll yield some probable conclusions. So inductive arguments are all about that, trying to show that something is probably the case. So I'm going to have you look at this argument about Beyonce once again. So is this a deductive or inductive argument? In other words, what's it trying to do? Is it trying to get you to think that something's definitely the case, or is it trying to get you to think that something's probably the case? Okay, so if you have your answer, let's talk about why it's a deductive argument. The reason it's a deductive argument is that what it's trying to do, it's pretty clear, is show you that Beyonce's definitely mortal, 100%. It's not just trying to show, yeah, she's probably mortal. It's trying to show you that for sure she's mortal. Okay, so it's not always explicit, but you can tell that, and especially because they're not even trying to hedge it by saying, well, Beyonce's probably mortal, it's a deductive argument. And as I say, most moral arguments are going to be deductive in type. Okay, so the next thing we want to know is, well, does it work? Is it a good argument? And we're going to come back to that in a little bit when we talk about valid and invalid arguments. Okay, so on to our next. Here's a little bit more of an in the wild argument. Notice that arguments in the real world, in the wild, so to speak, aren't always set out in the order that we saw the Beyonce argument. So not always set out in order, in logical order, so to speak. Sometimes the conclusion's at the beginning, sometimes the conclusion's at the end. The premises aren't always in order. So take a look at this and see, how would you label it? So how would you label the premises and the conclusion of this argument? Okay, I'm going to give you a second to do that. Now, make sure that you have tried to do this before listening ahead to me giving you the answer to this, because it's a helpful exercise. So, what did you have as your conclusion? Now, hopefully, you'll all have said that the first sentence, we should invite the new team members to lunch on Friday. That's the conclusion of the argument. That's what you're trying to give to the reader as a take-home message. That's what you're trying to convince whoever it is about. Okay, so the other two are the premises. So premise one is announcing a principle, right? A general kind of rule of thumb. And often you'll see in deductive moral arguments, often the first premise is going to be some kind of statement of principle, some kind of general moral rule of thumb that's being set out. And very often the following premises, premise 2 or even premise 3 and premise 4, are kind of plugging in the specific example you're talking about into that general principle and seeing, well, if we apply that general principle to this specific situation, what result are we going to get? And that's exactly what we see here. So premise 1 would be, at this office, we believe in doing what we can to make new people feel welcome. So that's your general principle. All right, well, how does that apply to this question of whether we should invite the new team members to lunch on Friday? Well, our last sentence tells you just that. So our last sentence is our premise 2. Inviting the new people to lunch on Friday is an example of just that. Namely, inviting the new people to lunch on Friday is an example of this principle that in this office, we believe in doing what we can to make new people feel welcome. So you're just plugging in your specific situation, right, into that general principle, right? So what kinds of actions do we do on the basis of our belief that doing what we can to make new people feel welcome is a good thing? Well, one thing that you can do to enact that principle is to invite new people to lunch. Okay. I think that's actually true. I think it's a pretty good argument depending on the context. So hopefully that will all seem pretty intuitive and right to you. If it doesn't, pop into the forum and discuss it among each other, and I will be popping into the forum as well. But that's what the argument looks like. Okay, and also notice that it is a deductive argument. One thing we talked about a little bit in the reading is the idea of hidden premises. So especially in the wild, right, in public discussion, even in philosophy papers, although less so, and when people try and convince each other about what the right thing is to do in real world situations, you're often not going to sit down and read an argument with all the premises labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and in the proper order and so on. Often what you'll find is that there's some assumption or some principle doing some work in the argument, doing the work in getting you toward that conclusion, but that's not stated. And sometimes that's because it's so obvious or it's so much a matter of common agreement that, you know, the person doesn't think it's even worth saying, right? Now, occasionally that can actually be significant, and sometimes you find yourself disagreeing with somebody and you can't quite figure out why you're disagreeing, right? One really good question to ask is, well, is there a hidden premise that's really driving this argument that we're disagreeing about? And maybe you can diagnose the disagreement in a helpful way. And often some of the tools of critical thinking that philosophers use can be neat tools to try and diagnose disagreement, right? Because if we're trying to resolve a disagreement with somebody about what we ought to do, the first thing that we need to do is just figure out exactly what is going on in our disagreement. Philosophy is good for that. It can help us diagnose and pinpoint what is it that we're actually differing about, and then you can go on and try and resolve, well, who's right. So have a look at this argument. So it's a three-part argument. Premise one is electronic surveillance in the workplace undermines workers' privacy. Okay. Premise two is this new software on our work computers is a form of electronic surveillance. Okay. And the conclusion is, therefore, introducing this new software is morally wrong. Okay, so give yourself a moment and try and figure out, is there anything that's not said explicitly in premise one and premise two that's getting you to this conclusion that introducing this new software is morally wrong? And again, you might want to pause this just to make sure that you are going to come up with your own answer to compare with what we say. Okay, if you haven't attempted an answer, and don't worry if it's still a little bit difficult, this is mainly just to illustrate. The hidden premise here is that undermining workers' privacy is morally wrong. Notice that premise one and premise two don't explicitly say that, right? So you have that this software is electronic surveillance, and you have, well, anything that's electronic surveillance undermines workers' privacy. What you get at the conclusion is that this is morally wrong. But of course, what's driving that is the principle that undermining workers' privacy is morally wrong. Okay, so we'll actually be talking about worker privacy later in the course, so I hope you keep that specific problem in mind. But just notice that even though in this case, because it's just as an example, the hidden premise seems fairly obvious, but actually the moral significance of workers' privacy is kind of a substantive moral issue, and how far should you go in either direction is more thorny than you might think, and we'll be talking about that later on in the course. But again, just get yourself into the habit of looking for those hidden premises. What are the assumptions that are not being stated that are nonetheless playing a role in the argument? A little bit, and talk about another way in which a deductive argument can work or not work. This is soundness. So remember, validity is all about structure, right? You don't need to know whether the premises are true or false. It's if they were true, would the conclusion follow? Obviously, in the real world, we also want to know something about whether the whole thing is true or false or not. So that's where soundness comes in. So a sound argument, as you saw from the reading, is a valid deductive argument where all the premises are true. Okay, so here, you know, the argument is sound if you're talking to somebody who's really from Cincinnati. So premise one, I think, is true. If you're from Cincinnati, you're from Ohio. Okay, Cincinnati is in Ohio, so yeah, it's pretty solid. If you're from Cincinnati, you're from Ohio, that is true. Premise two, well, let's imagine you're talking to somebody who's from Cincinnati. If that's the case, then premise two is true as well. And given that it's a valid argument form, well, we know that if your valid argument has premises that were true, then the conclusion would follow. So now we know that premise 1 and 2 are true because we're talking to somebody from Cincinnati. And yes, it does follow. It has to follow. So this is a sound deductive argument as long as you're talking to somebody from Cincinnati. And if you wanted to just make that super watertight, you can kind of reformulate the argument to put in the name of somebody who you know is from Cincinnati. Again, you might want to practice making some simple examples of sound deductive arguments, and remember that all sound deductive arguments are by definition valid, okay? Because soundness requires two things. Number one, validity, and number two, all true premises. So you might want to follow the pattern, and you can do this in the discussion forum. That's something for you to do in your comments, is come up with simple examples and tell us deductive, inductive, valid, invalid, sound, unsound. Use the pattern there and see what you can come up with. Now let's look at our example 2 in terms of soundness. Okay, so number one, all Supreme Court justices have graduated from law school. As far as I know, that is true. You'd certainly hope so, right? So let's say that that is a true premise. And premise 2, well, I have a real world friend called Karen who did graduate from law school. So let's say we're talking about my friend Karen specifically, and yes, it is true that she graduated from law school. Now, is this a sound deductive argument? Take a moment to write down your answer. Now, interestingly, here is an example of a deductive argument that has all true premises, but it's unsound. Why? That's right, because it's invalid, right? So invalid arguments can have all the true premises in the world, but they don't fit together, right? And I think that's an interesting thing to bear in mind, because somebody can put together and tell you a whole lot of things that are actually true, but get out of them a conclusion that's just not supported by those facts. Okay, and that's a good example of this, right? Premise 1 and premise 2, I'm telling you a whole lot of true stuff, but what isn't right is the conclusion that I try and get out of that therefore my friend Karen is a Supreme Court justice. Okay, let's move on. Now here we're going to talk about inductive arguments. And again, most moral arguments are deductive in form, but just for completeness, I'm going to run through a little bit more quickly the basic idea behind strength and cogency. Okay, so here's an example of an inductive argument form. Now, the way in which this can be good or bad, again, it's a little bit parallel to what we find in deductive arguments. There are two different ways in which inductive arguments can be good. Number one is strength, and that's a little bit analogous to being valid, where it's all about, well, if the premises were true, would the conclusion here probably follow? And cogency is, well as the structure being good, as well as it being a strong argument, well, are the premises actually true? So here, notice as well that strength is a little bit more a matter of judgment, right? You might have a reasonable disagreement, right, about whether this really is a strong argument, right? Does that level of having an awesome day when you wear these socks really support the conclusion, right? That is probably going to be an awesome day. A little bit more room for maneuver there, and that's fine, right? Because probably can mean, 51%, it can mean 99.9%. There's a little bit more room for interpretation and give. Okay, and we can talk about this example a little bit more in the discussion forum. So strength is, well, if all the premises were true, would the conclusion probably follow? And cogency is, are the premises all true, as well as this being a strong argument? Now here are some examples I'm just going to leave you with to discuss in the forum. Tell me about this argument. Deductive, inductive? Does it work? If so, why? Use the terminology that we've been talking about. Here's another example to talk about in the discussion forum. Again, what type of argument is it? Can you label the parts? Does it work? What would you need to know whether it worked? So especially seeing as we're kind of at the beginning here, I'm going to offer some suggestions. So I've given you some examples to talk about, but also a good thing to do in the discussion forum is to come up with examples. Just make them up of deductive and inductive arguments, valid arguments, sound arguments, unsound arguments for that matter, strength and cogency. So make stuff up, have a little fun with it. You can ask examples about what we've talked about, comment on those examples and questions, and analyze the examples discussed here. I'll be jumping into the forum to answer your questions and respond, so I will see you there.